a relationship that spans 12,000 years, crosses every continent, and touches nearly every aspect of human civilization. We're talking about cannabis, a plant that has been cultivated, revered, demonized, and rediscovered more times than perhaps any other species in human history. Before we settle in for this extensive exploration, please take a moment to like this video if you find it informative, and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy this kind of deep historical content. Drop a comment below, letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always fascinating to see this global community come together. Now, dim the lights if you can, maybe grab a warm drink, and let's ease into this remarkable story. Tonight's journey will take us from the windswept steppes of Central Asia to the royal courts of ancient China, from the ritual chambers of Scythian shamans to the laboratories of modern neuroscientists, and from colonial American farms to contemporary dispensaries. This is the complete history of cannabis, a plant that helped build empires, sparked scientific revolutions, became the target of moral panic, and is now experiencing a renaissance that's reshaping medicine, agriculture, and criminal justice around the world. The story of cannabis begins long before written history, in an era when humans were still learning to cultivate the land and settle into permanent communities. Archaeological evidence suggests that cannabis, specifically the species Cannabis sativa, originated in the mountainous regions of Central Asia, particularly around what we now call the Altai Mountains, straddling the borders of modern-day Mongolia, Russia, Kazakhstan, and China. This region, with its harsh continental climate and diverse ecosystems, provided the perfect evolutionary crucible for a remarkably adaptable plant. Around 12,000 years ago, as the last ice age retreated and human societies began the momentous shift from hunting and gathering to agriculture, cannabis was among the first plants to capture human attention. The reasons were immediately practical. Cannabis grows remarkably fast, reaching maturity in just a few months. Its fibrous stalks could be processed into strong, durable cordage and textiles. Its seeds were nutritious and could be pressed for oil, and certain varieties of the plant produced resinous flowers with psychoactive properties that early humans discovered had profound effects on consciousness and well-being. The earliest concrete evidence of human interaction with cannabis comes from the island of Taiwan, off the coast of mainland China. Archaeological excavations there have uncovered pottery, decorated with impressions of hemp cords dating back to approximately 8,000 BCE. These ancient artisans were using cannabis fibers to create the distinctive patterns on their ceramics, demonstrating that even 10,000 years ago, humans had developed the technology to process cannabis plants into usable fiber. But the relationship went deeper than simple pottery decoration. In the Yangshao culture villages of ancient China, dating to around 5000 BCE, archaeologists have found hemp fibers woven into textiles, proving that Neolithic peoples had already mastered the complex process of retting, spinning, and weaving cannabis fibers into cloth. This was revolutionary. For the first time, humans could clothe themselves in something other than animal skins. They could create garments that were lighter, more breathable, and could be produced without hunting. The implications for human development were enormous. The ancient Chinese didn't just use cannabis for textiles. By 4000 BCE, in the village of Panpo in central China, hemp was considered one of the 5 sacred grains, alongside millet, rice, wheat, and soybeans. Cannabis seeds were being consumed as food, ground into meal, or pressed for their oil. The plant had become fully integrated into the agricultural and culinary life of these early farming communities. Chinese tradition attributes some of the earliest recorded knowledge of cannabis as medicine to Emperor Shen Nong, a legendary figure said to have lived around 2700 BCE. Shen Nong, whose name means divine farmer, is revered as the father of Chinese agriculture and herbal medicine, though whether he was an actual historical person remains a matter of scholarly debate. According to legend, he personally tested hundreds of herbs, even reportedly suffering poisoning multiple times in his experiments. The text known as the Shen Nong Ben Kao Jing, which bears his name, describes cannabis among 365 medicinal plants, though the oldest surviving copies of this pharmacopoeia date only to around 50 CE. nearly 3 millennia after Shen Nong supposedly lived. Based on what we know of oral traditions and the compilation of ancient Chinese medical knowledge, this text likely represents accumulated wisdom passed down through generations, rather than the work of a single individual. In this compilation, cannabis was recommended for treating ailments including malaria, rheumatism, menstrual problems, and as a pain reliever and sedative, suggesting that by the time this knowledge was written down, the Chinese had extensive experience with the plant's therapeutic properties. The Chinese name for cannabis, ma, appears repeatedly in ancient texts, describing both the plant itself and its various preparations. The ancient Chinese recognized that different parts of the plant had different properties and uses. The seeds, called ma ren, were used as food and medicine. The fibers, processed from the stalks, were used for textiles and rope, and the resinous flowers, though less commonly mentioned in early texts, were understood to have mind-altering properties that could be used ceremonially or medicinally. One of the most remarkable applications of cannabis in ancient China was in papermaking. In 105 CE, a court official named Kai Lun perfected a technique for creating paper from hemp fibers mixed with tree bark, fishing nets, and old rags. This innovation would revolutionize human communication and knowledge preservation. For centuries, hemp remained an important material for papermaking in China, and the technology eventually spread along the trade routes to the Islamic world and then to Europe. As cannabis cultivation spread from its Central Asian homeland, it followed the great migrations of ancient peoples. The plant traveled with nomadic tribes, merchant caravans, and conquering armies. Seeds were carried in leather pouches, planted in new territories, and adapted to local conditions. Cannabis proved remarkably versatile, growing well in temperate and subtropical climates across Eurasia. One of the most significant discoveries in recent years has been the 2,500-year-old cemetery at Jiuzhankal, in the Pamir Mountains of western China. Excavations at this high-altitude site, over 3,000 meters above sea level, revealed wooden braziers containing burnt cannabis residues. Chemical analysis confirmed that this wasn't just any cannabis. It was a variety with significantly elevated levels of THC, the primary psychoactive compound in the plant. The burned plant material was found alongside the bodies of deceased individuals in what were clearly ritual burials. This discovery revolutionized our understanding of ancient cannabis use. It provided concrete scientific evidence that by 500 BCE, people in Central Asia were deliberately cultivating and using psychoactive varieties of cannabis in religious or funerary ceremonies. The high-altitude environment may have naturally stressed the plants, causing them to produce higher concentrations of THC as a defensive mechanism. But human selection likely played a role too. Ancient peoples were observing which plants had the strongest effects and deliberately cultivating those varieties. The Jiuzhankal cemetery wasn't an isolated case. Similar evidence has been found across Central Asia and the Eurasian steppes. A tomb near the city of Subaixi in China's Xinjiang region, dating to around 750 BCE, contained the mummified remains of a shaman buried with nearly 800 grams of processed cannabis with high THC content. The plant material had been carefully processed, with male parts removed to concentrate the psychoactive flowers. This wasn't casual use. It was sophisticated, intentional cultivation of cannabis for its mind-altering properties. The ancient Scythians, a nomadic Indo-European people who dominated the steppes of Eurasia from about 900 BCE to 200 BCE, became legendary for their use of cannabis. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, provided one of the earliest written accounts of what appears to be Scythian cannabis rituals. He described how the Scythians would erect small tent-like structures, place hot stones inside and throw cannabis seeds onto the stones. The resulting vapor would fill the tent, and the Scythians would inhale the smoke, howling with pleasure, according to Herodotus's account. Based on Herodotus's description and archaeological evidence from Scythian burial sites, this practice seems to have been ritualistic rather than simply recreational. The Scythians apparently used cannabis in specific ceremonial contexts, particularly in purification rites following funerals. After burying their dead, Scythian mourners would enter these vapor baths as part of their ritual cleansing, suggesting the cannabis-induced altered state may have been understood as a form of spiritual purification, possibly a way to commune with the deceased and ensure safe passage to the afterlife. Archaeological excavations of Scythian burial mounds have confirmed Herodotus's accounts. Tombs contain elaborate gold and bronze vessels, many showing residues of both cannabis and opium, suggesting that the Scythian elite used multiple psychoactive substances in their rituals. One particularly striking find from a Scythian tomb in the Caucasus region contained gold vessels with residues of cannabis that had been processed into a concentrated form, possibly similar to modern hashish. The Scythians were not isolated in their use of cannabis. As they travelled and traded across the vast Eurasian steppes, they carried cannabis seeds and knowledge of the plant with them. Through their interactions with other cultures, Greeks, Persians, Thracians, and various Asian peoples, cannabis knowledge spread even further. In ancient India, cannabis became deeply embedded in religious and cultural life. The plant arrived in the Indian subcontinent somewhere between 2000 and 1000 BCE, likely brought by the Aryan peoples who migrated into India from Central Asia. The Sanskrit texts known as the Vedas, composed between 1500 and 500 BCE, mention cannabis under the name bhang, identifying it as one of the 5 sacred plants that release humans from anxiety. In Hindu tradition, cannabis became particularly associated with the god Shiva, one of the principal deities of Hinduism. According to legend, Shiva discovered cannabis growing on the mountainside, consumed it, and adopted it as his favourite food, earning him the title Lord of Bhang. Even today, many sadhus, Hindu holy men, and ascetics consume bhang as part of their spiritual practice, believing it aids meditation and brings them closer to Shiva. The ancient Indian medical system of Ayurveda, which developed over thousands of years, incorporated cannabis as a therapeutic agent for numerous conditions. Ayurvedic physicians prescribed cannabis for pain relief, to stimulate appetite, to treat digestive disorders, and to calm anxiety. Different preparations were created for different purposes. Bhang, a drink made from ground cannabis leaves mixed with milk and spices, was used both medicinally and recreationally. Ganja, referring to the flower buds, was smoked or eaten, and charas, a form of hand-rolled hashish made from live plants, was used for its more potent effects. Cannabis use in India wasn't confined to religious or medical contexts. It was woven into the social fabric of Indian life. During festivals like Holi, the spring celebration of colours, bhang consumption was, and still is, common. Wedding celebrations often featured bhang drinks. The plant was seen as benevolent, a gift from the gods to ease human suffering and enhance joy. In ancient Egypt, cannabis appears less prominently in the historical record than in Asia, but evidence suggests it was known and used. Cannabis pollen has been found on the mummy of Ramses II, who died in 1213 BCE, suggesting the plant may have been used in burial rituals or as medicine. The Ebers Papyrus, an important Egyptian medical text dating to around 1550 BCE, mentions a plant that some scholars believe to be cannabis, recommending it for treating inflammation and various other ailments. Egyptian use of cannabis may have been primarily for hemp fibre production, with the psychoactive properties being a secondary consideration. The hot, dry climate of Egypt would have been suitable for growing cannabis, and the strong fibres would have been valuable for rope and textile production. However, the presence of cannabis pollen on royal mummies suggests that the plant held some ceremonial or medicinal significance beyond simple fibre production. The ancient Mesopotamian civilizations of Assyria and Babylonia also knew cannabis. Cuneiform tablets from the 1st millennium BCE refer to a plant called kunubu, or kunabu, which most scholars identify as cannabis. The linguistic connection to the modern word cannabis is striking and suggests a long history of cultural transmission. The Assyrians may have used cannabis as an incense, burning it to produce aromatic smoke for religious ceremonies. Some researchers have speculated that cannabis might be the mysterious plant mentioned in the Old Testament as cannabosum, an ingredient in the holy anointing oil described in the Book of Exodus. However, This identification remains controversial and disputed by many biblical scholars. What is clear is that psychoactive plants of various kinds were known and used in the ancient Middle East, and cannabis was likely among them. The ancient Greeks and Romans occupied an interesting position in the history of cannabis. Both civilizations knew of the plant primarily through their contacts with the peoples to their east, the Scythians, Thracians, and various Asian cultures. Hemp fiber was valued for rope and textile production, particularly for naval applications. The Greek word cannabis and the Latin cannabis show that the plant was part of their botanical vocabulary. However, the Greeks and Romans seem to use cannabis primarily for its fiber rather than its psychoactive properties. There are few clear references to recreational or medicinal use of cannabis in Greco-Roman literature, though some passages are ambiguous and have been interpreted by some scholars as possible references to cannabis intoxication. The Greek physician Dioscorides, whose 1st century CE herbal text De Materia Medica remained influential for over 1500 years, described cannabis and its uses. He noted that hemp was useful for making rope and that cannabis juice could be used to treat earaches and reduce sexual desire. Later Greek and Roman physicians, including Galen, mentioned cannabis in their medical writings, though generally for minor applications rather than as a major therapeutic agent. One intriguing passage in Homer's Odyssey has sometimes been interpreted by scholars as a possible reference to cannabis, though this identification remains highly speculative. When Helen of Troy slips a mysterious drug called nepenthe into wine to erase grief and anger, some researchers have wondered whether this might have been cannabis. However, the identification is uncertain at best, and the drug could have been any number of psychoactive substances known to the ancient Mediterranean world, or indeed an entirely fictional creation of Homer's imagination. What is clear is that the Greeks and Romans, like other ancient Mediterranean peoples, were aware of cannabis and made practical use of it, even if they didn't embrace it with the same enthusiasm as the cultures to their east. The plant's reputation as a valuable fiber crop and a minor medicinal herb would persist in Europe for centuries. As the ancient world gave way to the medieval period, cannabis continued its journey across continents and cultures. The rise and expansion of Islam in the 7th century CE created new patterns of trade and cultural exchange that would significantly impact the history of cannabis. In the Islamic world, the use of cannabis, particularly in the form of hashish, became both controversial and widespread. The early Islamic period saw hashish spreading throughout the Middle East and North Africa, though its use was often debated by religious scholars. The Quran explicitly prohibits alcohol, but it says nothing specific about cannabis, creating ambiguity about its permissibility under Islamic law. Traditional accounts attribute the discovery of hashish's intoxicating properties to a Sufi mystic named Haydar, said to have lived in Khorasan in modern-day Iran, around 1155 CE. According to this story, Haydar, feeling oppressed by the summer heat, wandered into the fields and ate some cannabis plants, which lifted his spirits remarkably. He returned to his monastery and shared the discovery with his fellow Sufis, who began using cannabis as an aid to meditation and mystical experience. While the literal truth of this origin story remains uncertain, such tales often serve more as symbolic narratives than historical documentation. It captures something meaningful about how hashish use spread in the Islamic world. The association with Sufi mysticism reflects a real pattern, as many mystical religious movements did incorporate hashish into their practices, viewing altered states of consciousness as potential paths to divine experience. By the 12th and 13th centuries, hashish use had become common enough in the Islamic world to attract the attention of physicians and scholars. The great Andalusian botanist and pharmacologist Ibn al-Bayta, who lived from 1197 to 1248 CE, described cannabis extensively in his compendium on simple medicaments and foods. He distinguished between different varieties of the plant, noting that cannabis indica from India had particularly strong psychoactive properties compared to varieties grown for fiber. The medieval Islamic world became a center of hashish production and use, particularly in Egypt and the Levant. Cairo developed a reputation for its hashish dens, where people gathered to consume the drug in social settings. The Egyptian authorities periodically attempted to suppress hashish use, with varying degrees of success. In 1253, the Mamluk emir ordered the burning of all hashish crops, but the prohibition proved impossible to enforce. The association between cannabis and controversy intensified with the legend of the Assassins, a sect of Nizari Ismaili Muslims active in Persia and Syria from the 11th to 13th centuries. According to stories popularized by Marco Polo and other medieval European travelers, the leader of this sect, known as the Old Man of the Mountain, would supposedly drug his followers with hashish, transport them to a secret garden filled with pleasures, and then convince them that this garden was paradise. To return to this paradise, they would need to carry out assassinations on behalf of their leader. Modern historians treat this story with considerable skepticism, viewing it largely as medieval propaganda designed to demonize a political rival. The name assassin likely derives from hashishin, meaning users of hashish, but this was almost certainly a derogatory term used by the sect's enemies, rather than an accurate description of their practices. The connection between the sect and hashish use appears to have been invented or greatly exaggerated by hostile sources. Nevertheless, the legend persisted for centuries in European imagination and contributed significantly to negative Western perceptions of cannabis as a drug that could make users violent and easily manipulated, associations that would echo through later prohibition efforts. Despite periodic prohibitions and controversies, cannabis remained part of Islamic culture throughout the medieval period. It was used medicinally, recreationally, and sometimes spiritually. Medical texts described its properties and uses in detail. Poets wrote verses celebrating or condemning it. It became woven into the cultural fabric of many Islamic societies, particularly in urban centers. Cannabis also spread through the Islamic world into sub-Saharan Africa. Arab and Swahili traders carried the plant down the East African coast, and it eventually spread into the interior of the continent. By the time Europeans began exploring Africa in the 15th and 16th centuries, cannabis was already established in many African cultures, used both medicinally and recreationally. In East Africa, cannabis became known as bang, borrowed from the Indian term, or by various local names. It was incorporated into traditional medicine and sometimes used in religious or social ceremonies. Archaeological evidence from Ethiopia, including smoking pipes dated to around 1320 CE with cannabis residues, confirms that the plant had become part of African culture by the medieval period. In southern Africa, the indigenous Khoisan and Bantu peoples were using cannabis long before European colonization began in 1652. The plant integrated into local agricultural and cultural practices, cultivated alongside traditional crops. When Europeans arrived in South Africa, they encountered established traditions of cannabis use and cultivation. Meanwhile, in Europe during the medieval period, cannabis existed primarily as hemp, a valuable agricultural crop grown for its fiber. The cultivation of hemp for rope, textiles, and paper became increasingly important as European maritime powers developed their navies and merchant fleets. A warship required enormous quantities of rope for rigging, and hemp was the finest material available for this purpose. A single large warship might require 50 to 100 tons of hemp rope. The Viking Age saw extensive use of hemp for shipbuilding. The longships that carried Norse raiders and explorers across the North Atlantic used hemp rope and sometimes hemp sails. The Norse sagas occasionally mention cannabis, though interpretations are debated. Some scholars believe references to certain plants in Norse mythology may actually be to cannabis, though this remains speculative. By the High Middle Ages, hemp cultivation had spread throughout Europe. It was grown extensively in England, France, the Low Countries, Germany, and Italy. European farmers understood how to cultivate, harvest, and process hemp efficiently. The plant was valuable enough that it often appeared in tax records and trade regulations. Cities like Bologna in Italy became centers of hemp processing, supplying rope and textiles to merchants across Europe. The word canvas itself derives from cannabis, reflecting the historical importance of hemp fabric. Before cotton became dominant, canvas made from hemp was the standard material for sails, tents, and heavy-duty cloth. Artists painted on hemp canvas. Soldiers' tents were made from it. The importance of hemp to pre-modern European economies can hardly be overstated. During the Age of Exploration, from the 15th century onward, hemp became even more crucial. The Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, English and French empires all relied on hemp for their navies. Christopher Columbus's ships carried hemp sails and hemp rope. Portuguese explorers sailing around Africa used hemp rigging. The Dutch East India Company, one of the most powerful commercial enterprises in history, required vast quantities of hemp for its merchant fleet. Hemp cultivation was so important to early modern European states that they sometimes mandated it. England under Henry VIII passed laws requiring farmers to dedicate a portion of their land to hemp cultivation to ensure adequate supplies for the Royal Navy. The economic and military importance of hemp made it a strategic resource, and governments took hemp production seriously. When Europeans began colonizing the Americas, they brought hemp with them as one of their essential crops. The plant adapted well to North American conditions and quickly became an important part of colonial agriculture. The first hemp crop in what would become the United States was likely planted at Jamestown, Virginia, in the early 1600s, using seeds brought from Europe. Colonial American farmers grew hemp extensively. The fiber was used for rope, textiles, and paper. Hemp fabric, while rougher than linen or cotton, was durable and practical for work clothes, sacks, and other utilitarian items. The seeds could be pressed for oil, used for animal feed, or even consumed as human food in times of scarcity. The importance of hemp to colonial America is reflected in numerous historical facts. George Washington grew hemp at Mount Vernon as one of his primary crops, keeping detailed journals about hemp cultivation techniques. Thomas Jefferson grew hemp at Monticello and worked on breeding improved varieties. Benjamin Franklin operated a mill that processed hemp into paper. The abundance of hemp paper in colonial America meant that many documents, including early drafts and letters, were written on it, though the final versions of the Declaration of Independence and Constitution were actually written on parchment made from animal skin rather than hemp paper, as is sometimes incorrectly claimed. However, it's important to note that colonial American hemp was grown primarily for fiber, not for psychoactive use. The varieties cultivated were those bred over generations for maximum fiber production, which typically meant lower concentrations of THC. The colonists were interested in hemp as an industrial and agricultural commodity, not as a drug. That said, Americans weren't entirely ignorant of cannabis's medicinal properties. Medical knowledge from Europe and elsewhere included information about cannabis as a therapeutic agent. Colonial-era medical texts sometimes mentioned cannabis tinctures and extracts for treating pain, inflammation, and other conditions. Pharmacies occasionally stocked cannabis-based medicines, though these were far from the most popular or commonly prescribed treatments. The 18th and early 19th centuries saw continued hemp cultivation across America, though the industry faced increasing competition. Cotton, introduced from India and adapted to American conditions, began replacing hemp for many textile applications. Cotton was softer, easier to process with the newly invented cotton gin, and well suited to the plantation economy of the American South. The tobacco industry also competed with hemp for land and agricultural labor. Despite this competition, hemp remained an important crop through the mid-1800s. The cordage industry in particular relied heavily on hemp. American manufacturers produced rope, twine, and heavy textiles from domestically grown hemp. The westward expansion of the United States created demand for hemp in the form of wagon covers, rope, and other pioneer supplies. The 19th century brought a new dimension to the Western world's relationship with cannabis, the discovery and exploration of its medicinal properties by modern scientific medicine. This transformation began with a relatively obscure Irish physician working in India. William Brooke O'Shaughnessy arrived in Calcutta in 1833 as a surgeon with the British East India Company. As he established his medical practice and engaged with Indian culture, O'Shaughnessy became fascinated by the local use of cannabis as medicine. He observed Indian physicians prescribing cannabis for a wide range of conditions and was struck by the relief it seemed to provide patients. O'Shaughnessy decided to investigate cannabis systematically using the tools of Western scientific medicine. Between 1838 and 1840, he conducted a series of experiments, first on animals to establish safety, then on human patients. He tested cannabis extracts on patients suffering from conditions including rabies, rheumatism, epilepsy, and tetanus. His results, published in a series of papers, were remarkable. In cases of muscle spasms, convulsions, and tetanus, O'Shaughnessy reported that cannabis provided dramatic relief that no other medicine of the time could match. Patients who had been writhing in agony from tetanus spasms calmed significantly after receiving cannabis tincture. While the drug didn't cure the underlying infections, it greatly reduced suffering and in some cases appeared to extend patients' lives by allowing them rest and sleep. O'Shaughnessy's work sparked enormous interest in cannabis as medicine among Western physicians. He brought cannabis preparations back to England in 1842, and within a few years, cannabis tinctures and extracts were available in pharmacies throughout Britain, Europe, and North America. Pharmaceutical companies began producing standardized cannabis preparations, marketed under various names for treating pain, muscle spasms, anxiety, and numerous other conditions. The mid to late 19th century represented a golden age for medicinal cannabis in the Western world. Cannabis extracts were listed in the pharmacopoeias of the United States, Britain, and most European countries. Physicians prescribed cannabis tinctures routinely. Pharmacies stocked multiple cannabis preparations. Medical journals published studies investigating cannabis's effects and therapeutic applications. Cannabis proved particularly popular for treating neurological conditions. Physicians prescribed it for epilepsy, though results were inconsistent. It was used for migraine headaches, often with reported success. Patients with muscle spasms from multiple sclerosis or other conditions found relief with cannabis. The drug was even used as a painkiller during childbirth, and accounts suggest that Queen Victoria's personal physician, Sir John Russell Reynolds, prescribed cannabis to her for menstrual pain, though direct documentation of her cannabis use remains elusive. Beyond prescription medicine, cannabis became an ingredient in numerous over-the-counter patent medicines that proliferated in the 19th century. These tonics, elixirs, and remedies often contained multiple ingredients, including opium, cocaine, cannabis, and alcohol, along with various herbs and flavorings. They were marketed with extravagant claims for treating everything from coughs to cancer, though their actual efficacy was highly variable. One particularly interesting 19th century phenomenon was the hashish parlor. In the 1850s and 1860s, establishments where people could consume hashish began appearing in major American and European cities. New York City reportedly had hundreds of such establishments by the 1880s. These weren't medical facilities, but social spaces where curious middle and upper-class patrons could experiment with exotic intoxication in relatively safe, supervised settings. The American writer Fitzhugh Ludlow captured this era in his 1857 book The Hashish Eater, which described his extensive experiments with cannabis. Ludlow's vivid accounts of hashish-induced visions and altered perceptions influenced public perceptions of cannabis, painting it as exotic and mysterious, but not particularly dangerous. The tone of 19th century writing about cannabis was generally curious and exploratory, rather than fearful or condemnatory. French intellectuals and artists also experimented with hashish during this period, most famously the Club des Hashichins, a group that met in Paris in the 1840s and included figures like Charles Baudelaire, Théophile Gautier, and Alexandre Dumas. These literary experimentations produced writings that described hashish experiences in romantic, often fantastical terms, contributing to cannabis's image as an exotic substance associated with artistic creativity and altered consciousness. However, medicinal cannabis faced significant challenges even during its period of greatest acceptance. The potency of cannabis preparations was highly variable, making dosing difficult and unpredictable. Different batches of cannabis tincture might have wildly different strengths. Patients and physicians had trouble determining appropriate doses, leading to unpleasant experiences of over-intoxication or underwhelming effects from underdosing. Additionally, cannabis preparations were slow-acting and had long durations of effect compared to many other medicines. A patient taking oral cannabis might wait an hour or more before feeling effects, which could then last for several hours. This made cannabis impractical for many medical situations where quick relief was needed. The late 19th century also brought new competition to medicinal cannabis. The development of synthetic drugs provided alternatives that were more consistent, faster acting, and easier to dose precisely. Aspirin, synthesized in 1897, offered reliable pain relief and fever reduction. Injectable morphine, while highly addictive, provided powerful pain control with predictable rapid effects. These new synthetic drugs gradually displaced many older plant-based medicines, including cannabis. The early 20th century marked the beginning of cannabis's fall from grace in Western societies. Multiple factors converged to transform a medicine and industrial crop into a prohibited substance associated with crime and moral degeneracy. This transformation involved racism, economic interests, sensationalist media, ambitious bureaucrats, and shifting social attitudes toward intoxication and personal behavior. The Mexican Revolution of 1910 sparked massive migration of Mexicans into the United States, particularly into Texas and other southwestern states. These immigrants brought with them the tradition of smoking cannabis recreationally, something that had not been common in American culture previously. The Spanish term marijuana or marijuana entered American vocabulary, gradually replacing the more familiar cannabis or hemp. As Mexican immigration increased, so did anti-Mexican sentiment among many white Americans. The association between Mexicans and marijuana became a convenient vehicle for expressing xenophobic attitudes. Newspaper articles began appearing that portrayed marijuana as a dangerous drug that made users violent, crazy, and sexually aggressive. These articles often explicitly linked marijuana to Mexican immigrants, African Americans, and other marginalized groups, suggesting that these communities used marijuana to corrupt white society. The early 1900s saw the beginning of state-level marijuana prohibition. California, in 1913, became one of the first states to criminalize cannabis possession, though the law was aimed at regulating pharmacies rather than targeting recreational users. Other southwestern states followed, often explicitly citing concerns about Mexican marijuana use. These early prohibitions were not well enforced, and primarily served to give police additional tools for controlling marginalized communities. After the passage of the Harrison Narcotics Act in 1914, which regulated opiates and cocaine, attention gradually turned to marijuana as another drug that might need federal regulation. However, the federal government initially showed little interest in cannabis. The Bureau of Narcotics was more concerned with opiates, cocaine, and alcohol during Prohibition than with a drug that most Americans had never heard of. That changed with the appointment of Harry Anslinger as the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1930. Anslinger, a career bureaucrat who had worked in alcohol prohibition enforcement, needed to justify his agency's existence and budget after the repeal of Prohibition in 1933. He found his cause in marijuana. Anslinger launched an extraordinary propaganda campaign against marijuana that lasted for decades. He collected and publicized sensationalized stories about crimes allegedly committed under the influence of marijuana. He distributed these stories to newspapers, which eagerly reprinted them, often with lurid headlines. The accounts were frequently distorted or entirely fabricated, but they served Anslinger's purpose of portraying marijuana as a grave threat to American society. The propaganda painted marijuana as particularly dangerous to youth, claiming it could turn normal teenagers into criminals and moral degenerates with a single use. Articles and pamphlets described marijuana users becoming violent, insane, and sexually deviant. The racist subtext was barely hidden. Many of the stories explicitly focused on Mexican, African American, or other minority marijuana users, suggesting that these groups used the drug to corrupt white Americans. The 1936 propaganda film Reefer Madness epitomized this campaign, though it became a cult classic decades later for its over-the-top portrayal of marijuana's effects. In the film, wholesome teenagers are corrupted by marijuana dealers, leading to violence, attempted rape, suicide, and insanity. While the film seems absurdly exaggerated to modern viewers, it reflected the official narrative about marijuana that Anslinger and others were promoting. Anslinger's campaign culminated in the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. This federal law didn't explicitly prohibit cannabis, but it imposed such heavy taxes and regulations on cannabis transactions that it effectively made the drug illegal. Anyone who wanted to deal in cannabis had to obtain tax stamp, but the government made these stamps virtually impossible to acquire. Violations carried severe penalties, including imprisonment. The hearings for the Marijuana Tax Act were brief and one-sided. Anslinger and his allies testified at length about marijuana's dangers. Medical professionals and scientists who might have provided balanced perspectives were largely absent or ignored. The American Medical Association sent a representative who objected to the law, arguing that cannabis had legitimate medical uses and that the proposed regulations would interfere with medical practice. His concerns were dismissed. The hemp industry did raise objections, noting that the law would effectively destroy legal industrial hemp cultivation even though hemp fiber had no psychoactive properties. Their concerns were also mostly ignored, though some accommodations were made for hemp seed oil and birdseed. The law passed in 1937 with little public debate or awareness. Interestingly, during World War II, the federal government briefly reversed course on hemp. When Japan's conquest of the Philippines cut off American access to Manila hemp, a crucial cordage fiber, the US Department of Agriculture launched a Hemp for Victory campaign, encouraging farmers to grow hemp for the war effort. Thousands of acres of hemp were planted between 1942 and 1945. But when the war ended, the brief hemp revival ended with it, and cannabis prohibition resumed. The post-war period saw marijuana use spreading beyond the marginalized communities that had been its primary users in previous decades. Jazz musicians had adopted marijuana use in the 1920s and 1930s, finding that it enhanced their musical creativity and performance. This association between marijuana and jazz culture persisted and expanded. By the 1950s, marijuana had become part of the Beat Generation's cultural rebellion, used by writers, artists, and bohemians as part of their rejection of mainstream American conformity. The 1960s represented a watershed moment for cannabis in America and globally. As the counterculture movement gained momentum, marijuana use exploded among young people, particularly college students and those involved in the anti-war movement. Marijuana became a symbol of generational rebellion, a way for youth to reject the values and authority of their parents' generation. The widespread use of marijuana among middle-class white youth created a dilemma for authorities. Suddenly, it wasn't just marginalized minorities using marijuana, it was the children of doctors, lawyers, and politicians. The harsh penalties established in earlier decades began to seem excessive when applied to college students rather than Mexican immigrants or African-American jazz musicians. President Richard Nixon, elected in 1968, partly on a law and order platform, declared a war on drugs in 1971. While this initiative targeted all illicit drugs, marijuana was a particular focus. Nixon established the Drug Enforcement Administration in 1973 to coordinate federal drug enforcement efforts. He dramatically increased funding for drug enforcement and supported mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 placed marijuana in Schedule I, defined as drugs with high potential for abuse, no currently accepted medical use, and lack of accepted safety for use under medical supervision. This classification placed marijuana alongside heroin and LSD, and as more dangerous than cocaine or methamphetamine, which were placed in Schedule II. The Schedule I designation made marijuana research extremely difficult, creating a catch-22 situation where the government claimed marijuana had no medical value while simultaneously making it nearly impossible to conduct the research that might demonstrate medical value. Nixon's approach to marijuana appears to have been driven partly by political calculations. Years later, in a 1994 interview, Nixon's domestic policy advisor John Ehrlichman made a controversial admission that the war on drugs had been designed, at least in part, to criminalize and disrupt Nixon's political enemies, specifically the anti-war left and black communities. According to Ehrlichman's account, by associating these groups with drug use and then criminalizing drugs, the Nixon administration could arrest leaders, disrupt communities, and vilify opponents in the press. While some have questioned the timing and context of Ehrlichman's statement, it aligns with documented patterns of how drug enforcement was applied disproportionately to political opponents and minority communities during this era. Despite the harsh federal approach, the 1970s also saw the first moves toward liberalization at the state level. Oregon decriminalized marijuana possession in 1973, reducing penalties for small amounts from criminal to civil violations. Other states followed, and by the end of the 1970s, 11 states had decriminalized marijuana possession to some degree. These reforms reflected growing public recognition that marijuana was not the demonic substance portrayed in earlier propaganda. President Jimmy Carter, who took office in 1977, even supported marijuana decriminalization at the federal level. His drug policy advisor, Dr. Peter Bourne, publicly advocated for removing criminal penalties for marijuana possession. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the federal government might adopt a more rational approach to cannabis policy. That possibility evaporated in the 1980s with the election of Ronald Reagan. Reagan and his wife Nancy launched a highly visible anti-drug campaign that returned to the moralistic zero-tolerance approach of the Anslinger era. Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign targeted youth with simplistic messages about drug use. Meanwhile, Reagan signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which dramatically increased penalties for drug offenses and instituted mandatory minimum sentences. The 1986 law and its 1988 successor created the absurd situation where possession of small amounts of drugs could result in longer prison sentences than violent crimes. The three strikes provision meant that a third drug offense could result in life imprisonment without parole. These harsh penalties fell disproportionately on minority communities, particularly African Americans, even though data showed that white and black Americans used marijuana at similar rates. The war on drugs reached its peak intensity in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The federal drug control budget increased from about $1 billion annually in 1980 to over $17 billion by 1999. State and local spending on drugs enforcement increased proportionally. Police departments received military equipment and training for drug raids. Prosecutors prioritized drug cases. The United States incarceration rate skyrocketed, driven largely by drug convictions. Mandatory minimum sentences and harsh drug laws created a pipeline from minority neighborhoods to prisons. Young men, often African American or Hispanic, received lengthy sentences for marijuana offenses that would have resulted in probation or treatment for white defendants. Families were torn apart, communities were destabilized. The social costs of prohibition began to exceed any potential harms from marijuana use itself. Meanwhile, scientific research into cannabis and its effects on the human body was making remarkable discoveries that would eventually reshape the entire debate about marijuana. The key breakthrough came in 1964 when an Israeli chemist named Raphael Mechoulam successfully isolated and identified THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, as the primary psychoactive component of cannabis. Mechoulam, who had survived the Holocaust as a child in Bulgaria before emigrating to Israel, worked at the Weizmann Institute and later at Hebrew University. He was surprised to discover that while morphine had been isolated from opium in the 19th century, and cocaine from coca leaves around the same time, no one had yet isolated and identified the active compounds in cannabis. He set about remedying this gap in scientific knowledge. Mechoulam obtained 5 kilograms of seized cannabis from Israeli police and set to work separating the various compounds it contained. Using the chromatography and analytical techniques available in the 1960s, he identified THC and determined its chemical structure. He then tested his isolated THC on monkeys to confirm it produced the psychoactive effects associated with cannabis. Finally, he tested it on human volunteers, feeding them cake containing THC and observing the results. The human experiments revealed that different people had vastly different reactions to the same dose of THC. Some laughed uncontrollably, others became anxious or paranoid, some became deeply introspective and philosophical. The personality and mental state of the user seemed to strongly influence their experience, a finding that has been confirmed by subsequent research. Mechoulam's isolation of THC was just the beginning. In subsequent years, he and other researchers identified dozens of other cannabinoids in cannabis, including cannabidiol or CBD, which has significant therapeutic effects but doesn't produce the high associated with THC. They discovered that different strains of cannabis have different ratios of these compounds, explaining why some cannabis is highly intoxicating while other varieties have minimal psychoactive effects. The identification of THC led to a crucial question: how does this molecule produce its effects in the brain? Initially, many researchers assumed THC worked by disrupting cell membranes in a non-specific way, similar to how alcohol affects neurons. But in 1988, a team of researchers at the St. Louis University School of Medicine made a groundbreaking discovery: specific receptors in the brain that bind to THC. These cannabinoid receptors, designated CB1 receptors, are G-protein coupled receptors that are found throughout the nervous system. They are particularly dense in areas of the brain associated with memory, cognition, movement, time perception, and pleasure. The discovery of CB1 receptors was stunning because it suggested that the human body naturally produces substances that bind to these receptors. Otherwise, why would the receptors exist? In 1990, researchers cloned the gene for the CB1 receptor, allowing for detailed study of its structure and function. A second cannabinoid receptor, CB2, was discovered in 1993. CB2 receptors are found primarily in the immune system rather than the nervous system, suggesting they play a role in inflammation and immune response, rather than producing psychoactive effects. The existence of cannabinoid receptors implied the existence of endogenous cannabinoids, cannabinoids produced naturally by the body. In 1992, Machulam's team made another landmark discovery. They isolated and identified the first endocannabinoid, which they named anandamide. The name comes from the Sanskrit word ananda, meaning bliss, reflecting the joy and well-being that anandamide seems to promote. Anandamide is a fatty acid neurotransmitter that binds to CB1 receptors throughout the brain and nervous system. Shortly after the discovery of anandamide, researchers identified a second major endocannabinoid, 2-ileaglycerol, or 2-AG. Subsequent research has identified several other endocannabinoids, though anandamide and 2-AG are the most abundant and best studied. The discovery of endocannabinoids, their receptors, and the enzymes that synthesize and break them down revealed an entire previously unknown regulatory system in the human body, the endocannabinoid system. This system plays crucial roles in maintaining homeostasis, regulating everything from appetite and metabolism to pain perception, mood, memory, immune function, and reproduction. The endocannabinoid system works as a retrograde signaling system, meaning that endocannabinoids are released by neurons after they fire and then travel backward across synapses to bind to cannabinoid receptors on the neurons that stimulated them. This provides a feedback mechanism that helps regulate how strongly neurons communicate with each other, preventing either excessive or insufficient signaling. Research into the endocannabinoid system exploded in the 1990s and 2000s. Scientists discovered that this system is involved in virtually every physiological process. It regulates appetite and energy balance. The munchies that cannabis users experience result from THC activating CB1 receptors in brain regions that control hunger. It modulates pain, perception, which explains cannabis's analgesic effects. It influences mood and anxiety, accounting for both the euphoria and occasionally the paranoia that cannabis can produce. The endocannabinoid system also plays crucial roles in brain development, with cannabinoid receptors helping guide neurons to their proper locations during fetal development. This finding raised concerns about cannabis use during pregnancy, as introducing external cannabinoids might disrupt these developmental processes. Perhaps most remarkably, scientists discovered that the endocannabinoid system appears to be upregulated in many disease states. Chronic pain conditions show elevated endocannabinoid levels, as if the body is trying to heal itself. Inflammation activates the endocannabinoid system. Even cancer cells can express cannabinoid receptors, and some research suggests that cannabinoids might have anti-tumor effects, though this remains an active area of investigation. The scientific understanding of the endocannabinoid system provided a completely new framework for understanding both marijuana's effects and its potential medical uses. Instead of viewing cannabis as simply a plant with interesting properties, scientists can now understand it as containing molecules that interact with a fundamental regulatory system in the human body. This scientific progress occurred just as attitudes toward marijuana prohibition were beginning to shift. The war on drugs was showing clear failures. Despite massive spending on enforcement, marijuana use continued to increase, especially among young people. The harsh penalties were filling prisons without reducing drug availability. Meanwhile, the social costs of prohibition, shattered families, criminal records that prevented employment, distrust of law enforcement, became increasingly apparent. The medical cannabis movement emerged in the 1980s and gained momentum through the 1990s. AIDS patients discovered that marijuana helped with the nausea and appetite loss associated with their disease and its treatments. Cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy found that marijuana relieved nausea better than many approved anti-nausea medications. Multiple sclerosis patients experienced reduction in muscle spasms. Glaucoma patients found that marijuana could reduce intraocular pressure. These patients and their advocates began pushing for legal access to medical marijuana. In 1996, California voters passed Proposition 215, the Compassionate Use Act, making California the first state to legalize medical marijuana. The law allowed patients with a doctor's recommendation to possess and cultivate marijuana for medical use. It was a watershed moment that began a cascade of state-level reforms. The federal government, particularly under President Bill Clinton and then President George W. Bush, strongly opposed state medical marijuana laws. Federal drug enforcement agents raided medical marijuana dispensaries even when they were operating in full compliance with state law. The Justice Department argued that marijuana had no medical value and that state laws couldn't override federal prohibition. This created a strange patchwork situation where marijuana could be simultaneously legal under state law and illegal under federal law. Patients and dispensary operators who were following state regulations could still be prosecuted in federal court. The conflict between state and federal marijuana law became a major federalism issue, testing the limits of state sovereignty and federal authority. Despite federal opposition, the medical marijuana movement continued to spread. By 2010, 15 states had legalized medical marijuana. By 2020, that number had grown to over 30 states plus Washington, D.C. Each state created its own regulatory framework, leading to enormous variation in how medical marijuana programs operated. Some states, like California, had relatively loose programs where doctors could recommend marijuana for almost any condition, and patients could grow their own medicine. Other states created much more restrictive programs, limiting medical marijuana to specific severe conditions like epilepsy or terminal cancer, and requiring patients to purchase from licensed dispensaries. Some states allowed only low THC, high CBD preparations rather than full-spectrum marijuana. The medical marijuana movement faced skepticism from much of the medical establishment. Major medical organizations argued that smoked marijuana was not an appropriate medicine, that the dosing was imprecise, and that proper clinical trials had not been conducted to prove efficacy and safety. They advocated for developing isolated cannabinoid drugs rather than approving the whole plant as medicine. Some pharmaceutical companies did develop cannabinoid-based medications. Marinol, a synthetic form of THC in pill form, was approved by the FDA in 1985 for chemotherapy-induced nausea and AIDS wasting syndrome. Sativex, an oral spray containing both THC and CBD, was approved in several countries outside the United States for treating multiple sclerosis spasticity. Epidiolex, a purified CBD extract, was approved in 2018 for treating severe forms of epilepsy. However, many patients and advocates insisted that whole plant marijuana worked better than isolated cannabinoids. They pointed to the entourage effect, the theory that the various cannabinoids, terpenes, and other compounds in marijuana work together synergistically to produce therapeutic effects that isolated compounds cannot replicate. The debate between whole plant medicine and pharmaceutical cannabinoids continues today. The success of medical marijuana laws paved the way for the next major reform, legalization of recreational marijuana. In 2012, voters in Colorado and Washington state approved ballot initiatives that legalized possession and sale of marijuana for adults over 21. These were the first jurisdictions anywhere in the world to create fully legal, regulated recreational marijuana markets. The Colorado and Washington laws created state regulatory frameworks modeled somewhat on alcohol regulation. They established licensing systems for marijuana cultivation, processing, testing, and retail sales. They imposed taxes on marijuana transactions. They restricted marketing and prohibited sales to minors. They created driving under the influence standards for marijuana. Essentially, they treated marijuana similarly to alcohol, legal but regulated. The implementation of these programs was closely watched by the rest of the country and the world. Opponents predicted disaster. They claimed youth use would skyrocket, driving fatalities would surge, and general social disorder would result. Advocates countered that legalization would eliminate the criminal market, generate tax revenue, reduce incarceration, and allow for better regulation and quality control. The results have been mixed and are still being studied. Youth marijuana use rates have not increased significantly in most states that legalized, and in some cases have decreased slightly. This contradicts the prediction that legalization would lead to massive increases in teen use. However, adult use has increased somewhat, which was expected. Traffic safety data has shown some increase in marijuana-positive driving incidents, though disentangling marijuana's role is complicated by the fact that marijuana can be detected in blood long after its impairing effects have worn off. The technology for roadside marijuana impairment testing remains imperfect compared to alcohol breathalyzers. The black market has persisted in legal states, though it has shrunk significantly. Legal marijuana is often more expensive than black market cannabis due to taxes and regulatory costs. Some consumers continue to purchase from illicit sources to avoid these costs. However, most consumers prefer legal sources where quality is tested and regulated. Tax revenue from legal marijuana has been substantial. Colorado collected over $300 million in marijuana tax revenue in 2020 alone, money that funds schools, substance abuse programs, and other state priorities. The industry has created thousands of legal jobs in cultivation, processing, retail, testing, and related fields. The economic argument for legalization has proven compelling to many states. Following Colorado and Washington, additional states legalized recreational marijuana through ballot initiatives or legislative action. Oregon, Alaska, and Washington, D.C. legalized in 2014. California, Massachusetts, Nevada, and Maine followed in 2016. By 2025, nearly half the states have some form of legal recreational marijuana, and the majority of Americans live in states where marijuana is legal for adults. The state-by-state legalization has created an increasingly absurd situation where marijuana policy varies dramatically based on geography. A person can legally purchase and use marijuana in one state, then cross a state line and become a criminal for the same behavior. Federal prohibition means that marijuana businesses cannot access normal banking services, forcing them to operate largely in cash. Marijuana companies cannot deduct normal business expenses on federal tax returns. Medical marijuana researchers face bureaucratic obstacles that don't apply to other drugs. There have been multiple attempts to reform federal marijuana law. The Obama administration issued guidance directing federal prosecutors to generally not interfere with state legal marijuana operations. The Trump administration rescinded that guidance, but generally did not prioritize marijuana enforcement. The Biden administration has maintained a hands-off approach towards state legal marijuana while continuing to enforce federal law in cases involving large-scale trafficking or violence. Legislation to remove marijuana from Schedule or to completely decriminalize it federally has been introduced numerous times in Congress. These bills have gained increasing support but have not yet passed both houses of Congress and been signed into law. The politics of marijuana reform remain complex, with strong feelings on both sides and concerns about the details of implementation. The social equity dimension of marijuana legalization has become increasingly important. Advocates point out that the communities most harmed by marijuana prohibition, particularly black and brown communities, are often excluded from the legal marijuana industry due to lack of capital, criminal records from past marijuana convictions, and other barriers. Many states have implemented or attempted to implement social equity programs to address this. Social equity programs typically include provisions like expunging prior marijuana convictions, prioritizing license applications from individuals from communities most impacted by prohibition, providing technical assistance and low-interest loans to minority-owned marijuana businesses, and dedicating a portion of marijuana tax revenue to community reinvestment in areas harmed by the war on drugs. The effectiveness of these social equity programs has been mixed. Some states have made significant progress in creating diverse, equitable marijuana industries. Others have seen social equity programs captured by large, well-funded corporations who use minority partners as fronts. The question of how to repair the damage caused by decades of discriminatory drug enforcement while building a new legal industry remains challenging. Meanwhile, hemp has experienced its own renaissance. The 2014 Farm Bill allowed states to create hemp pilot programs for research purposes. The 2018 Farm Bill removed hemp, defined as cannabis with less than 0.3% THC, from the Controlled Substances Act entirely, making it a legal agricultural commodity at the federal level. This hemp legalization has sparked a boom in hemp cultivation and CBD products. Farmers across the United States have planted hemp for CBD extraction, fiber production, and seed. CBD products have flooded the market, appearing in everything from coffee to skincare products to pet treats. The FDA has struggled to regulate this rapidly growing market, as CBD is technically an unapproved drug and food additive. The hemp fiber industry is also reviving, with interest in hemp as a sustainable material for textiles, construction materials, and bioplastics. Hemp grows quickly with minimal need for pesticides or irrigation, making it environmentally attractive compared to cotton or synthetic materials. Industrial applications of hemp are being rediscovered and modernized. Research into cannabis and cannabinoids has accelerated dramatically in recent years as legal barriers have lowered. Scientists are investigating potential therapeutic applications for dozens of conditions. CBD has shown promise for anxiety, epilepsy, and inflammation. THC is being studied for pain, PTSD, and neurodegenerative diseases. Other minor cannabinoids like CBG and CBN are receiving attention for their potential therapeutic properties. Research is also examining the risks and harms associated with cannabis use. Heavy, long-term cannabis use, particularly when started in adolescence, is associated with some cognitive effects, an increased risk of mental health issues in vulnerable individuals. Cannabis smoke contains many of the same carcinogens as tobacco smoke, though marijuana users typically consume far less than tobacco smokers. The high-potency marijuana products available today raise questions about whether they pose greater risks than the lower-potency marijuana of past decades. The question of cannabis and mental health, particularly psychosis and schizophrenia, remains controversial. Some studies show associations between heavy cannabis use and increased risk of psychotic disorders, especially in people with genetic vulnerabilities. However, causation is difficult to establish. Does cannabis cause psychosis, or do people predisposed to psychosis self-medicate with cannabis? The evidence suggests that while cannabis doesn't cause schizophrenia in people who wouldn't otherwise develop it, it may trigger earlier onset or worsen symptoms in vulnerable individuals. Cannabis use disorder, while less severe than addiction to substances like alcohol, opioids, or methamphetamine, is a real phenomenon affecting a minority of regular cannabis users. About 9% of people who use marijuana will develop dependence, characterized by difficulty controlling use, continued use despite negative consequences, and withdrawal symptoms when stopping. The rate is higher among daily users and those who start using in adolescence. The evolving legal landscape has also changed patterns of cannabis consumption. Edibles, vaporizers, concentrates, and other products now dominate many legal markets, in contrast to the traditional dried flower that was historically the primary form of cannabis consumed. These products offer different onset times, durations, and intensity of effects, creating both opportunities and risks for users. High-potency concentrates, some containing 80 to 90% THC, raise particular concerns. These products can produce intense, sometimes uncomfortable intoxication, especially in inexperienced users. Reports of cannabis-induced anxiety and emergency room visits for cannabis over-intoxication have increased in legal states, though serious medical consequences remain rare. Edibles present their own challenges. The delayed onset of effects, sometimes an hour or more after consumption, leads some users to consume more before the initial dose takes effect, resulting in over-intoxication. Packaging and dosing regulations have helped address this issue, but edibles remain a source of accidental consumption by children and pets when not properly secured. The international landscape of cannabis law is also shifting. Uruguay became the first country to fully legalize recreational marijuana in 2013. Canada followed in 2018, creating a nationally regulated market. Mexico's Supreme Court ruled prohibition unconstitutional, though full legalization has been delayed. Several European countries have decriminalized possession or created legal medical marijuana programs. Even nations with historically harsh drug laws are reconsidering their approaches. However, cannabis remains illegal in most of the world, and some countries maintain severe penalties, including lengthy prison sentences or even death for cannabis trafficking. The international drug control treaties that most nations have signed technically prohibit legalizing cannabis, though countries like Canada and Uruguay have proceeded with legalization anyway, testing the flexibility of these treaties. The World Health Organization has recommended rescheduling cannabis at the international level to better reflect current scientific understanding. In December 2020, the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs voted to remove cannabis from the strictest control category, though it remains a controlled substance under international law. This shift represents growing international acceptance that cannabis is significantly less dangerous than drugs like heroin or cocaine. Looking toward the future, several trends seem clear. More states and countries will likely continue to legalize or decriminalize cannabis in some form. The market for legal cannabis will continue to grow and mature. Research into cannabinoids and the endocannabinoid system will expand our understanding of how these substances affect human health. The legal and regulatory frameworks will continue to evolve based on experience and evidence. Major questions remain unresolved. How should society balance individual freedom to use cannabis with concerns about public health and safety? What level of regulation is appropriate for cannabis products? How can the harms caused by prohibition be remedied? What role should large corporations play in the cannabis industry versus small businesses and individuals? How can youth access be prevented while allowing adult use? The story of cannabis is ultimately a story about the complex relationship between humans and psychoactive plants, about cultural attitudes toward intoxication and consciousness, about racism and criminal justice, about science and medicine, and about the persistent human drive to alter perception and seek pleasure or relief from suffering. It's a story that has unfolded over 12,000 years and is still being written today. From its origins on the steppes of Central Asia, cannabis has traveled with humans across the globe. It has clothed us, sheltered us, fed us, healed us, and altered our consciousness. It has been sacred and profane, medicine and poison, essential crop and prohibited drug. The plant has remained constant, but our relationship with it has been anything but. The modern era represents not the end of the cannabis story, but perhaps a new chapter. As prohibition crumbles and research accelerates, we're rediscovering knowledge that ancient cultures possessed and uncovering new understanding about how cannabis interacts with human biology. We're grappling with how to integrate this ancient plant into modern society in ways that maximize benefits while minimizing harms. The journey from the ceremonial braziers of ancient Central Asian shamans to contemporary marijuana dispensaries represents one of the longest and most complex relationships between humans and any plant species. It's a relationship that reflects our values, our prejudices, our scientific understanding, and our endless capacity for both wisdom and folly. As we move forward, the lessons of cannabis history remain relevant. We should approach psychoactive substances with respect for their power and appropriate caution about their risks. We should base policy on evidence rather than hysteria or prejudice. We should recognize that prohibition often causes more harm than the prohibited substance itself, and we should remember that humans have sought to alter their consciousness throughout history, and that this drive is unlikely to disappear regardless of legal restrictions. The complete history of cannabis is in many ways a mirror reflecting human history itself. It shows us at our best, innovative, curious, seeking healing and transcendence, and at our worst, prejudiced, punitive, willing to destroy lives in the name of moral righteousness. As we continue to write the next chapters of this history, we have the opportunity to learn from past mistakes and build more rational, humane, and evidence-based approaches to cannabis and drug policy generally. The plant that began its journey with humans 12,000 years ago in the mountains of Central Asia continues to shape human culture and society today. From ancient shamans to modern researchers, from colonial hemp, farmers to contemporary cannabis entrepreneurs, from Anslinger's propaganda to today's legalization movement, the story of cannabis is woven into the fabric of human civilization. It's a story that reminds us that our relationships with plants and substances are never simple, always evolving and deeply connected to fundamental questions about freedom, health, justice, and what it means to be human. So as we conclude this extensive journey through the complete history of cannabis, take a moment to reflect on how this single plant has touched so many aspects of human existence. Consider how attitudes and laws that seemed permanent have shifted dramatically within a single generation. Think about how scientific discovery can transform our understanding of substance we thought we knew. And remember that history continues to unfold, and the decisions we make today about cannabis will shape the story that future historians tell. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of cannabis history.